as we come to know who we are as a true self, we recognize that that which is an embodiment of love comes from God, and that which is an embodiment of fear does not come from God. When we're on this early faith journey and we are feeling betrayed and legitimately wounded and angry and things like that, there is a time to metabolize and process that.
Welcome to the In Her Image podcast, where we seek and celebrate Mother God through the scriptures, scholarship, mythology, the arts, and everyday life. I am Jessica Woodbury, your host, and I am so excited to have with us the wonderful Valerie Hamaker from the Latter-day Struggles podcast today. So welcome to the podcast, Valerie.
Hi, I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me, Jessica.
I am assuming that many of you listeners know who she is, but we're still going to start with a little bio of her before we get going in this conversation. Well, actually, first I'll set it up. So first I'll just say, as hosts of this podcast, sometimes we'll come together and talk about what do we think are some of the topics that we feel like our listeners are really struggling with. And so as we were thinking about that and talking about that, we have talked about, how many responses we get from people about navigating the difficult emotions that come with this journey. And we have the wide range of emotions. People share just how inspired they are and the joy that they are experiencing, but we also get a lot of messages about the struggles that unfortunately often come with this journey of awakening to the divine feminine. And it's really sad that that happens because it's a beautiful thing, but because of other things that we have to navigate while also going on this journey, often there can be some wounding or some sadness and other things that are really hard to work through as well. So we wanted to do an episode talking about the complexity of all of that. And we wanted to invite someone on who could help us to untangle some of that complexity and to possibly talk with us about ways to navigate the difficult side of this, and then also be able to figure out how best to move forward in a way that can help us to more fully experience and embrace the joyful aspects of it as well. So Valerie was one of the first people to come to mind for us as we thought about that, because she has this background in therapy and she's constantly talking about these issues as well in a way on her podcast. So I'll start with her bio now, and then we will dive into this important conversation. So Valerie Hamaker is a trauma-informed marriage and family counselor. Again, this is one of the main reasons why we're so happy to have you here in this conversation. The host of the popular LDS faith expansion podcast, Latter-day Struggles, Valerie is passionate about providing a safe and psychologically sound place for those in and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, seeking spiritual, psychological, and relational healing connected to faith crisis. Valerie's podcast, supporting and processing groups, online classes, and consulting coaching has helped thousands of people find depth, purpose, and spiritual healing. And so again, welcome, Valerie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Yeah. And is there anything else about who you are and things that you love that you want to share with us before we dive into this conversation?
Well, I am a lover of the outdoors. I have always been, I think I've really enjoyed this deep dive into gender, feminine, divine energies, because I have always noticed the balancing, or not to say that I'm fully a balanced person, but I have noticed that I have some masculine energy that has really served me well in my life that I couldn't put my finger on. And also that there are parts of me that I didn't understand about myself that as I have grown to better understand the divine, I can make better sense of myself. And so I guess the reason why I'm kind of trailing off on that is I remember as a child playing football in the front yard with my uncles and all of my cousins and always wondering, am I normal? Is that weird? I was definitely not going to do anything else because it was part of who I was. But now I can see that I was sort of embracing parts of my essential selfhood that wasn't always necessarily, I wouldn't say it was invalidated, but I don't know that it was fully embraced or, seen as like normal in sort of a more typical LDS traditional home. And so this study has just been so fun for me in better understanding the little girl that wanted to play with the boys, or the athlete, or that part of me that wants to get dirty in the mud and kind of things. And so anyhow, that's just a little bit about the fun-loving side of me that touches into this spiritual topic.
Yeah, I love that. I also am a lover of the outdoors and grew up as a little bit of a tomboy. And I love your image of like getting in the mud, because I feel like that's just what you continue to do in all sorts of other symbolic ways.
And so true.
Maybe we'll talk about a little bit here as well.
Yeah, so that's very true.
So as I shared at the very beginning, we wanted to have this conversation about this emotional journey that a lot of us go through, and some of the stages or just emotions, they're not always in stages, that many of us navigate as we are navigating the world while also experiencing an awakening or a growth of relationship to the divine feminine. And so Valerie here is constantly, talking about some of these types of issues that come with faith journeys. And I know that you have worked with countless individuals through groups, through coaching, through therapy that are dealing with these issues of faith journey, of a feminist journey, and of awakening to the divine feminine and the things that come with that. So what are some of the patterns that you have seen? What are some of the overall trends? And I know everyone's experiences are different, but what are some of the patterns that you have noticed in the way that people often emotionally respond to this journey? What that looks like for them?
Really good question. Yeah, so I was actually thinking about themes before you even brought that topic up. And so I'm kind of glad that you just led the way to something that felt really natural to my own process. I do have a lot of experience listening to people talking about the early faith journey. And also, I am happy to report, I kind of talk about my own, because my own faith journey didn't really begin, 2 decades ago, as much as I wish it sort of had. Because, I don't know, there's that part of me that wishes I was sort of like a precocious feminist, and yet I really wasn't. And so on the one hand, that's a little bit of a bummer. On the other hand, I keep appreciating that I evolved and grew at the pace that was right for me in my life. And also I am finding myself very grateful that because it's so recent, I have a lot of compassion on all of the parts of the spectrum, because I have a very vivid and recent memory of who I was before I had that hunger for an understanding of the feminine divine. I get that because that was me not very long ago. And so as far as themes go, it seems to me pretty consistent that when someone is on the cusp of or has entered into a spiritual expansion journey, it really goes hand in hand with a hunger for the feminine divine. And I think probably that's connected to when one is sort of primed to enter into a faith crisis, whether it be because life has just sort of thrust them into that by their experiences, or because they have grown and developed enough to where they are willing to sort of look at things that maybe were too scary to look at before. The person in this space is open to asking questions that maybe they were too scared to ask before. And I think one of those primal questions that maybe just sort of resides deep down within each of us is, who am I in the context of God? And who is God, and who is it that I am connected to at this very primal core level? And I think what that leads us towards is the simplicity and the logic that if human beings are created as women and men, it follows that those whom we worship are in some way an incarnation of who we are. We are like them in some way. And so I'm not so sure how I feel about an embodied God or how that looks. To me, that feels very comfortably something that I'm happy to be in that space of unknowing. I don't need to put my finger on it. But what feels clear to me is that whoever I am like them. And therefore, as a woman, there must be someone that I worship, my creator, my source, that is more like me than maybe I was taught and told. And so I think that, like I said, that's sort of logical, like a child would come to that conclusion, right? Because it just makes sense. And then I think what happens is we become socialized in a patriarchal world, and for many of us, that we are also socialized in a patriarchal church layered on top of a patriarchal world. And we sort of brush that aside because we're led to believe that there's something uncomfortable or not talked about or not okay about that. That's not normal to be thinking about that. But as we step into this world of expanding faith, I think we start having more courage to go, wait a minute, there's something here about how I have been taught who to worship and who not to worship, and how to see myself in the context of God. And then the questions seem less scary. And because the questions seem less scary, we begin to approach them, I think partly because another kind of theme or pattern, Jessica, that I notice is that we stop being afraid of God himself, right? And I'm saying himself on purpose because early on it's a him. And that idea of like, maybe it's okay if I have questions. Maybe it's okay if I don't know. Maybe I can doubt what I've been taught. And at that point in time, we start looking at ourselves and our journey, and we start being more open to the possibility that maybe I can approach God not as someone who is fearful and masculine and punishing, but maybe God is neither fearful and punishing, but maybe God is also not just masculine. And so it's almost like we start like opening up all of these possibilities of how to see ourselves, how to see God. And I think that curiosity and that confidence naturally leads to the question of where is she? And then I think it's really beautiful because it's truth hidden in plain sight. Once we start asking those questions, it's literally like everywhere. There's so much to be found. And for me, at least, it was like, good heavens, how did I live all my life? First of all, not being curious. And secondly, she's everywhere. And then I think that's kind of you talked about a second ago, like it's exciting, but then also brings up a whole bunch of other emotions based on our programming. So I'll pause there because I know I just sort of said a lot of things.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And it's interesting when you're talking about like this faith journey leading to an opening of what God is. And I think that is a really common path. And then there's also sometimes an awakening to the divine feminine that sometimes starts with that and then leads to a faith journey.
I love that. What you just said is really poignant. And I think what you're describing actually is I hadn't thought about that, but now that you're saying that rings very, very true to me. In part, perhaps because, and I'm thinking again of patterns, in our faith tradition, because we not only are an institutional authoritarian patriarchy, we live in a world that is progressing beyond some of the more archaic understandings of gender and hierarchy, right? And so the questions are being asked in our LDS faith tradition because we are surrounded by more enlightenment. There is restoration of God's truth everywhere around us, at least in the Western world. And so I think we're starting to go, okay, what used to probably feel normal in terms of patriarchal oppression around us is no longer normal. And women are starting to sort of have the eyes to see that like something is not quite right here. This doesn't feel good. But I think we have more courage to say it doesn't feel good because we're seeing more equality emerging around us. And I think kind of as an aside to that, I do feel that we have history in the LDS church that definitely brings with it the baggage of early Christianity. But I also think we can throw on top of it the trauma of Mormon polygamy, which I think is a transgenerational trauma that women and men carry in their bodies, and is a strong force for the longing that human beings have as divine to heal. And so as we carry this not very many generations in front of ourselves, right? Some of us, it's our great or great-great-grandparents. We're only 4 or 5 generations from polygamy, some of us. And so there's a hunger to heal that. And what it brings us to is starting to ask very, very challenging and important questions about gender, sexuality, hierarchy, power, and where did that come from? And did these constructs, in fact, come from God? Or did they come from human beings that are frightened and, that are afraid and have created structures of power? And when we start sort of better understanding that, we understand that the history of patriarchy and the rise of patriarchy is very concurrent with the fall of the feminine divine. And for me, at least, all of the sudden, as I start stepping back further and further, and one thing leads to another thing, which leads to another, answer to a question, all of a sudden the pieces of the puzzle start coming together. And my own heritage as a Latter-day Saint woman and a great-great-granddaughter of polygamous women brings me into contact with the loss of a feminine divine as very much a part of my own story.
Yeah. So what did that look like for you? How did you become awakened more to this? And what was kind of the emotional journey that you went on as you did so?
Yeah, thank you for that question. It's a fun story, and I'll try to abbreviate it. My first thought was that, as I mentioned before, I really, this feels very strange for me to be saying because it feels so dissident to who I am now, but I really wasn't a feminist per se. I was quite a conformist, traditionally believing Latter-day Saint woman for a really long time. And I have two beautiful young adult daughters who have been my teachers and my mentors in many things. And I remember as they were teenagers going through their own spiritual awakenings before myself and my husband, and just giving us a ride. And we were just, shocked and overwhelmed by what is happening. And it was really just because these beautiful young women were valuing themselves and seeing that they were not honored for their value in their own church. But I think they also saw in their parents' devotion to God, through the lens of the LDS faith, that there was good in there too. And I think they really wrestled with a love and loyalty that they had for the faith of their parents, but also a real courage and a sense of integrity that something was not right. And I remember my daughters saying to me many times, "Mom, I know you're a feminist. Deep down inside, you are a feminist." And I think it was because they saw my courage and my confidence and certain ways that I was showing up in the world that really had a lot of healthy feminist energy, or at least energy that looked like a woman who takes ownership of herself and knows her value in the eyes of divine masculine and feminine sources. And so they felt that from me, and I didn't disagree with them, but I didn't really know what that meant. And they were just so frustrated for me because I think they wanted me to grow quicker than I was able to, which in a way has been such a gift to me when I want people in my circles to grow quicker than is comfortable for me. And I remember myself and my daughters just being so frustrated. And then as I evolved and grew and life experiences exposed me to greater light and truth and more courage, definitely going to counseling school, sitting with people suffering, brought more courage and confidence and more of an ability for me to be a complex thinking human being and have the ability to ask harder questions. That led me to the ability to start pushing back against my own overwhelming need for comfort, safety, and belonging that a more traditional Orthodox religious system was, in fact, bringing me and helping me with for the time, for that period of my life. And so I think what happens, and what happened to me, and I think what I also notice is happening, is something shifts in our souls, and the desire for safety and comfort never really leaves, of course. That's so innate to humanity. But I also think that there's a longing within our souls that says, you're okay, and now it's time to be a little bit more brave. You can belong to yourself. You can belong, it's okay for you to be a little more brave than you thought you could be, and start asking hard questions. And so when I got to that point, I remembered finding The Dance of the Dissonant Daughter.
Ooh, it's a good one.
Sue Monk Kidd. And if anybody hasn't read that yet, I've read and listened to that book so many times. It's the spiritual journey of a beautiful Baptist woman. But she talks about how the feminist journey it's non-denominational, right? This is the journey of many Christian women who have been raised in patriarchal societies. And as I read that, my memory was, this is true. Like what she's describing, I mean, to me, it sort of woke me up to things that I had not seen that were very apparent to my own upbringing in a patriarchal system where we are taught explicitly to not honor and learn how to be in deep connection with the feminine divine. And it felt quite quickly obvious to me that a patriarchal structure is threatened by a feminine divine, because a feminine divine leads one to have questions about this idea of essential superiority of masculinity over femininity. And if you have a feminine divine, then why are we not giving our own women the exact same power that men receive, because they are sons of God? And so it starts to challenge not just theology on the level of belief, but it also really pressures how do we practice and how are we actually structuring our institutions of spirituality. And so the loss of and the fear of speaking about and worship of a feminine divine is very much connected to the fear of the loss of power that a patriarchy holds. And so for me, it was almost as much a spiritual journey, which it was deeply spiritual, but it was also very academic. Like as I learned these things, it became very clear what was going on, not only in my own church system, but also at large in other Christian and non-Christian faith systems where men in power were threatened by the reality that an acknowledgement of the feminine divine would in fact seemingly cause them a loss of status and power.
And stability, even maybe even predictability. It's like we have been doing things a certain way for so long, and so we feel like this is the right way. And so the idea that maybe something isn't right is very destabilizing. Even for like some women, right? There can be this fear of the destabilization as well. And wait a minute, if we haven't been doing things totally right, then what does that mean for everything else and the way we're doing things?
Very good point. And you know, I'm actually reading The History of God right now. I was reading it literally this morning, and what she continues to teach me as she's walking me through the history of the construction of the gods of all of the great religions is our understanding of God evolves throughout history, and they change according to how they actually nurture the souls of the children of God. And it's not that like our divine parents are unstable themselves, but it's that human beings, as culture and time changes, our needs evolve, and we need to construct and reconstruct gods to help us know how to be in connection with them. And what you're describing is this idea that human beings, from like a psychological perspective, that's really scary. Like we like to kind of like put our thumb on something and say, this is how it is. And it's how it's always going to be. And I also think there's a little bit of like, again, fear that drives ego that says, oh my goodness, what does this mean if I'm wrong, right? Like there's that sense of like, if I don't get this right, then maybe that means I'm not inspired and then I'm not of God and all those things. Whereas I think you know and I know, like if like human beings are allowed to be a work in process, and it's okay for us to be allowing our understandings not only to evolve, but to be constantly evolving, because that is what we do as we learn to grow to become like them. And so there is a threat connected to disrupting the status quo, but that in and of itself to me is the definition of true, authentic spirituality. It's that vulnerability of saying, I don't know, and I'm okay doing what I think is right until I receive further light and knowledge, and then being so excited to just expand that and share that, because it's not about me, right? It's not like a definition of I must not be good enough because I got this wrong. It's more like, no, we all learn and grow. That's what it means to be a child of God. And so to introduce or to change, to expand our understanding of God it's actually could not be more beautiful, a more beautiful embodiment of what it means to be a child of God. So I feel like it's really sad that there's that resistance to acknowledging I did not know before because I was socialized in this kind of a world, you know, patriarchal in nature to be specific to our conversation. But now I know, and let us expand what truth has always been.
Yeah. And, one of the things that you talked a lot about is fear already. The fear of those in power and the institution, the fear of sometimes us as we're seeking, and we are coming to realize that maybe we didn't have all the answers. Maybe the way that we have been living, there's a lot more, and that can be destabilizing. And I think about some of the responses that I've gotten from people as I knew we were having this conversation. I threw it out there to individuals on Instagram, to some friends, about what their experiences have been like. And fear was definitely a very common one that was shared, and a very common emotional experience that was shared with this. And it's interesting the way that I have seen that expressed from those individuals, talking about the fear of not knowing how to engage with the institution even. So, or having had negative experiences with institution and then having a fear that keeps them silent. So that is a really common one that people talk about. I might kind of run down some of the feedback that I received. So I tried to break it up into both the positive and the negative because I wanted to hear it all, because it is all a part of the journey, right? And some of the positive emotions and states that people talked about receiving on this journey as they begin awakening to the divine feminine and to a heavenly mother is feeling joyful, feeling hopeful, feeling excited, empowered, energized, loved, watched over, supported, comforted, happiness, wonder, curiosity, expansion, power, peace, relief, catharsis, greater love for self, greater love for others, self-respect, a greater desire to strengthen spiritual gifts, freedom to explore, strength, no longer tolerating mistreatment, misogyny, etc. So there's all these wonderful feelings and experiences people have, but then also some of the negative. They talk about feeling isolated and misunderstood. Anger is a huge one. Sadness, hopelessness, betrayal, confusion and uncertainty, distrust, cognitive dissonance, fear, exhaustion, dread for the conflict and work I'll have to do in my community, feeling like an outsider, grief, frustration, loneliness, rebellion, and woundedness. I mean, there's this wide array, right? And I think about my personal experience. And in my experience, for me, this whole thing started off, like with the hard emotions, and then I was able to build myself up and get to the joy and get to the empowerment. And now I honestly mostly am just most of the time in like that empowerment and everything. But my awakening started with a very sudden, painful awakening to the absence of the mother and what I felt like that was saying about me and my daughter. I had one daughter at the time, and just hearing in general conference them talking about the Father, the Father, the Son, and they are the perfect example of eternal families. And all of a sudden me being like, whoa, like, where am I? Do I not matter? And so I was hit very suddenly with a wave of sadness, betrayal, actually, which was surprising because I was 100% in. Like, I was a full-on, fully invested Latter-day Saint, we say now. Back then it was Mormon, But, and just feeling really lonely and having to deal with feeling this betrayal that wasn't necessarily to anyone in particular, but to kind of like the institution, I guess, for supposedly having this doctrine. And it felt like keeping me from it in a way, hiding it from me in a way that made it so that I didn't feel like I knew my mother and that I didn't know that I mattered as much. And I had never felt that before. I actually felt totally equal before that moment in the church. Like, I didn't see the inequality. And then I suddenly did very, very strongly. And then I had to like try to figure out how to work through that and get to a place where, as I started to try to find her and seek her and build relationship, then I started to have the empowerment and to feel the love and to feel the joy of it. But I know like some of our other listeners share some of their experiences. One shared, she said, I'm new to the journey and at first was really excited to learn about how Heavenly Mother was hidden in plain sight. But that excitement has worn off as I continue to go to church where it's only Heavenly Father and He this, He that. So now I'm feeling more frustration in having to insert Heavenly Mother and all women's divine importance while those around me aren't making space for it. And then she talks about that fatigue and the anger that she feels with that. So when you've been working with individuals, what have you noticed? Are those kind of two really common journeys? And how do you help people to navigate that mess of all that positive and negative emotion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think what it comes down to is the importance of, first of all, coming to an understanding of who we are as a true self, the core of our being as a self, as a child of God with masculine and feminine energies, and recognizing that that core being has the capacity to discern for ourselves what is true, good, and beautiful. And taking ownership of the journey for ourselves. And that's really, really, really important. And it's the key component of pretty much everything that I ground my work in, because focusing on faith crisis connected to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints requires that we look at the common pain point that everyone has that finds my work is that I often sort of say this jokingly, but I truly mean it. People that come to my Latter-day Struggles podcast were never lukewarm. Like, they were so deeply committed to the church. And that is why they are in so much pain. The pain that they feel is proportionate to the trust they gave, that they outsourced to a patriarchal institution to define them. And I also try to help people recognize that some of what they took in has been and continues to be and will be forever a force for good in their lives. And also part of what they took in has in fact estranged them from who they truly are and their own capabilities to find God. And so I want people to start having a little bit more confidence in themselves, to recognize that they are a trustworthy source for their own relationship, for their own unfolding relationship with a new kind of divine parents, right? So not only do I want them to redefine how most of them saw God, the male figure, but to introduce confidence that you can approach her even if you have been taught otherwise. And so aside with the focus I have on finding the true self within each of us and having the confidence to embrace God and to trust ourselves to do that, comes the second piece, which is differentiation from the church. And I really think that's a really important piece of this puzzle, because for so many of us in early stage faith, which is very normal, right? Like, we grow in faith just the way we grow. You know, the physical body, you can see it changing, and you can see developmental passages that happen from kind of lying inert and like waving our hands and feet around, you know, to like rolling, to crawling, to walking, to running, right? And then having control to do all of the above as we desire. Like, that in and of itself, we can see, but the soul is also doing the very, very same thing. And so in early development, to hand our power over to the big people and to the big strong men, it makes sense. It's perfectly appropriate at a certain point in our soul's development. And yet, by the time we hit this point where the awakening is happening and we start looking around and seeing something's off, what I try to work with people in this space in doing is to recognize that we have given our power away, and we have allowed them to define not only who we are, but also who God is. And also, I think for many of us, we've confused God with the church itself.
Which is understandable, because we've had people say, if you don't agree with something that the church has said, then you should replace that with Jesus Christ, right? And say, well, I don't agree with Jesus Christ. So we've been told explicitly sometimes to do that, right?
We come by that very, very honestly. Like, I think the church, our church and other churches mean well by their constituents. That doesn't always mean it translates into helpful ideas, right? And so we have been told to basically sort of rely on the church as the vehicle and the only vehicle by which we will find God. And so what you're speaking into about the grief and the betrayal is very real, because our group of people that we're talking about, the really, really all in, the most devout of the devout, we bought in and we said, if you say it, it is true and I believe it. And then we oftentimes fashion our lives around this deep and profound trust and commitment. And I think we do that because we're really like earnest and we want to do the right thing by God. And it's that same earnestness that I think leads us further down the path, which then, of course, creates the opening for the spiritual journey, like the furthering of the spiritual journey, which then opens our eyes to the realization that, like, oh my goodness, a part of me that is really earnest and very trusting, I gave too much away, or at least I gave too much away for too long. And so the healing comes from, first of all, having a ton of grace on ourselves that, yes, I gave a lot away, but it's normal to give a lot away when our souls and our spirits are young, and to trust. And then also, not only do we have grace on ourselves, but we start to take our power back and say, okay, the big people meant well by us, but for their own wounded reasons, they were wrong. They misinformed me about the nature of God and the nature of who I am in the context of God. And so I need to take ownership of this back and claim for myself who I am in the context of God. And what that means on the ground is, for many people, the need to redefine how they are in relationship with the church. And what I feel really strongly about is what that looks like for each individual is their work, right? Yeah. It's up to each individual to sort of decide how they want to connect with or stay connected with their faith from the like institutional perspective. But everyone that goes on this kind of a faith journey really does need to decide, how do I want to integrate my heritage faith into my life? Because what the commenters were saying that you were just reading a minute ago is very true. When one goes down this path, there's almost like I feel it myself when I'm in church, like a body ache, like a soul ache that comes in when I just hear over and over again masculine pronouns or the reference to only half of who God is, and how we that are on this journey, men and women, I believe, as their souls become more and more awakened to this, they recognize that, like, I am not only estranged from her, my feminine divine, but I am estranged to who I am in context to her. Like, men recognize, and I'm seeing this all of the time in my groups, because how I've spent a lot of time this year focusing on how patriarchy wounds men, that they are recognizing that there are large parts of their own souls that they have almost no access to, because they do not have an understanding of how to relate to the feminine within them that has been basically like stifled. And then women, of course, not knowing how to worship one that looks like them, we have lost touch with a confidence in ourselves. Like, we see ourselves, if we really bought into the process, we see ourselves as truly inferior, not knowing that we have something in our likeness or with our innate feminine energies to worship. And so it's painful to have this awakening and all of the joy and the excitement and the way your first commenter talked, like, that is there. But then I think it comes with the sorrow and the grief that, like, why would this be kept from me? Why would an institution that wants well for me and wants to give me knowledge and power to help me return to God, how is it that they are keeping from me or estranging me from who I truly am as a self?
Yeah. Yeah. There's so much in that. I think a lot of times people do wonder, both people who are going on this journey and people who are watching other people go on this journey. And maybe, I guess right now I'll look at the perspective of somebody watching somebody else go on this journey. It's like they're seeing someone and they're like, well, if this was a good journey, then why are you experiencing all this anger and pain? And, then maybe it's not a good journey. Maybe it's not good fruit. Maybe you shouldn't be going on this journey, right? And so sometimes I think people wonder why, if it was a good thing, would there be all of this hardship too, and this pain? And I think you absolutely hit in what you were just saying, how it's not the journey itself of awakening to the divine. It's then navigating relationship to an institution that we have given that power to. And that has, I'm going to say probably unintentionally, I don't know, right? Kept some of its membership from being able to grow into their fullest selves by only presenting half of God, even though they have access to more, or say that they believe in more, and in all these different ways that it's not living up to what we expected it to do in our lives, and it's not living up to the potential that it has in our lives to be able to help us to come to know God more fully and to know ourselves more fully. And I think it's really interesting when you're talking about like the depth of the pain is often in direct relation to the depth of kind of the investment and the trust that we had given that institution. And so I think that's really important to point out that like it's not awakening to the divine feminine that's causing the pain. It's then navigating the patriarchal world, relationships, institution that we are surrounded by with this new knowledge that also makes us look back at our past and can lead to like almost a distrust of people, institutions, whatever it is, that we really, really trusted and loved and invested in and believed were doing the same fully for us too.
So loving what you're saying. I'm going to circle back to a comment that you made just a second ago about this, like making the correlation between you're over there really uncomfortable, you're feeling grief, you're feeling all of these big emotions. So therefore it must be that this journey is either dangerous or wicked, not okay, right? And so what actually kind of emerged in me is how that is evidence of a world that is dominated by the masculine. Feminine energy can walk into the shadow and can sit in the darkness and can experience depth and grief, and it can hold complicated experiences between the beauty of how I learned to, say, for example, be kind and loving through my Mormon primary, but also how I learned that there's only so much that a woman can do. And so feminine work actually exposes us to not only the light, but the fact that darkness is part of the journey towards God. And so if we ever find ourselves leaning into the binaries or leaning into the simple, clean answers, leaning into the straight and narrow path, we can know we are in masculine territory. And so when we as women or men find ourselves wanting something to be simple and crisp and clean, we know we have not only lost touch with the feminine within ourselves and in our culture, but that is evidence, of course, of the loss of the feminine divine, because that is the energy that is held by that part of sort of like the yin and yang energy of the world.
Yeah. And even in my last interview, it was with Dr. Christina Cleveland, author of God is a Black Woman. And we talked in there as well about this concept of how uncomfortable people can be with pain. And yet, like you said, the feminine way is to be open to understanding that it is only through pain that birth happens, that life happens. Because as women who give life, who go through the act of labor and giving life, you know, in a very real way that the greatest things, that the creation of new life requires pain and darkness and hardship. And so I think, that's really interesting to think about the way that just even the opposition to that concept is very masculine.
Yeah.
Well, you also talked previously about sitting in the pew at church and hearing those masculine words. And one of our listeners had kind of mentioned that as well. And you talked about experiencing and feeling this body ache in your soul as you hear over and over again these masculine pronouns, he, and just this ignoring of the feminine, of us, of you, you know. What can people do? How do people navigate that? Is it just going to be part of what we experience all the time? Is there a way to move past that or to not experience that quite so strongly as we claim our own power again? How would you help somebody really struggling with that?
Such a good question, and it actually comes up all of the time. On my Latter-day Struggles platform, everybody knows, and if they don't know, I'm going to say it one more time. I do not have, it is not appropriate, in my opinion, to define for someone how they worship and when and where they worship. And therefore, what that means by default is some people who I work with do want to stay in connection or, affiliated with, on a Sunday morning, a Latter-day Saint church, which also means that they will be sitting in a room that does not acknowledge the feminine divine or does so very, very, very minimally and with a little bit of fear and trepidation. And I think that's actually sort of ramped up even in the last few years. And so for that population of people, I guess what I would suggest is something that I have integrated into my life and into how I parent. What I find myself doing as a parent and as a partner and even internally with myself with regards to this is church for us has become not only a spiritual practice of showing up and sort of just taking in and receiving passively, but church for us is an active process of learning complex thinking and discernment skills. And so what we do with our children is when we attend, say, for example, a sacrament meeting, I will listen and do two practices for me have been very helpful. Because I've been in the same congregation for 2 decades, so I know these people pretty well, right? And I have also done a lot of leadership in the church. Back in my old, more Orthodox days, I've been on the other side of this question. And so one of my practices is taking in what feels like it hurts my heart from where I am in my own journey, but then also being able to listen to others and bear witness of how where they are on their journey is resonating with what they're experiencing in that room in a way that it's not resonating with me, but it gives me the space to learn how to be in connection with people that are not like me, that don't see the world like me, that are not bothered by things or that don't feel that body ache that I feel. And so I can practice making space for their legitimate reality based on who they are and where they are in their lives. That's practice number 1. Practice number 2 for me is if I hear something that hurts my heart and that I think is actually harmful. And what I mean by that is I feel like there are some things that are passively taken in so much by, say, for example, children or youth, that they integrate it without realizing that they're integrating it, because that certainly was my experience. And so let me just give you a little example, and I promise I'll get back to my main point. But I think little girls are integrating something when they see boys chosen over and over again. They may not acknowledge it in their consciousness. Some little girls are very much consciously bothered. Some are not. I was not as a child until I was. And then I realized, what did I take in that told me and convinced me that I needed to be a certain way in my young adult years that was not actually resonant with what my true self knew. I self-betrayed and did not do in my early years what my soul longed for because I followed the counsel of a prophet in the 1980s that told me to ignore my soul.
That's heartbreaking,
Yeah.
And yet it's a very common experience.
It's very common with our cohort of women. And so there are things that are being integrated outside of our consciousnesses. And so back to parenting, when I hear things that are subtle or maybe not so subtle, and I don't want my own children to be integrating them, then what we will do when we come home and we're eating lunch and having family time together and doing our lovely worship practices that I learned in this very church that we still practice, family scripture study, family home evening, prayer. We do all of those things because I hold them dear. That is part of who I am, even though I am, a deeply expanded and a different believer, right? But we will talk to these children about things that we hear that do not resonate with love. And so from the perspective of the feminine divine or things that come up that relate to gender, we will present something that was said or something that was taught, and we'll engage in dialogue with our children to offer to them opportunities to become critical thinkers about what was said. And we don't do this in the spirit of like criticism or like bashing the person that said it and things like that. That's not what this is about. It's more about, this is a theological moment where we are talking about what was learned and how does it resonate with our understanding of God as we understand them in this home. And the thing that's kind of cool, Jessica, is as we do this, especially when I have all of my children at home, I've got some grown-ups, young adults, so they're not always at home. But even when if we do this and we're not afraid to do this with all of them at home, they are going to have different responses and different experiences. I've got a kid on a mission, and I've got a kid who has taken her name off of the records of the church. And we can, all of us, sit in a conversation and dialogue about these ideas about the nature of God. And what they need to understand, that I think Nathan and I are trying really hard to do, is to help them see that you are on your own journey, and we want to make this space a place where it is safe for you to wrestle with what it means to be a child of God. And also, Nathan and I will talk to them about certain things that we hear that we worry about in terms of what it may internalize in a woman or a man based on issues of patriarchy, because it embeds in both women and men ideas about themselves that do not serve their souls well. And it's kind of cool. My children across the spectrum of formal belief or compliance or affiliation with the church, everyone resonates in the same place with that. All of my kids are like, that's not right. And I think it's because deep within them, there's something that feels that God is a God of love and equality. I mean, to put it in my kids' vernacular, it's not that deep.
It seems pretty basic, right? You're like, if I want to worship a God, then you would want to worship a God who is just and cares equally about all of their children.
Exactly. Not that deep.
So you started by talking about making space for other people. And I think that's hard, right? Because it seems like the church, when you think about stages of faith, there are a lot of different people at different stages of faith that may be in our church and pews, but in general, the conversation is usually stuck in one stage of faith.
True.
And probably most of the people there are in similar stages. And so it's hard because I know, like, as we change, sometimes people try to change us and say, you are in a wrong place. You need to think like us. And I think it can be easy for us then, as we expand and as we grow and learn things that help to empower us and help us feel closer to God and more to who we truly are as divine, limitless beings, that sometimes we want to like make other people be where we are too. And so what you were talking about when you're hearing those people and at church, and it's like giving them the grace of recognizing this is where they are. And this is what they believe, and it's maybe helping them at this point in time. And that differentiation, I think, is so important, like you talked about, of being able to see this is a person who this seems to be serving, and that is okay. And that's not serving me right now. But I can hear what they're saying, and I can go through that mental exercise of, yes, it is exhausting to constantly translate in your own brain and say heavenly parents and our divine mother or whatever it may be. But I know it's been really important for me to give that grace to people, to recognize that most of the people who are saying these things are not trying to intentionally hurt me, trying to intentionally exclude the divine feminine even, but just recognizing that, I was there. I was there, for me, it's maybe like a decade, 12-ish years ago, right? It was a very sudden shift for me, right? And so like, I very, very clearly remember what it was like to be there. And I wasn't doing it because I thought that she should not be a part of the conversation, or because I wanted women to be one down, or whatever it may be. And so I think that's really important, like you're talking about making space for people where they are, acknowledging where they are, and then having that ability to do that exercise within yourself that you're describing with your children, of just critically thinking about things and asking those questions and just saying, this is an exercise of, do I agree with that? Do I not? And it's okay to not agree. And I think that that is a really big hurdle to overcome too, because we've basically been taught to take what we've been told in church pews and to say, this is truth. And so you have to agree. So one of the other big emotions, like I mentioned near the beginning, that people experience a lot is fear. One person talked about how she felt so alone. All the loneliness and the feeling misunderstood was in part because of fear of sharing it with others, because of responses she'd seen to herself and responses she'd seen to others, of having recommends taken away for speaking about Heavenly Mother, or having been released from callings for different things. And someone else shared a story. She said, how do I navigate a stake presidency telling me not to discuss Mother in Heaven at church after being reprimanded for giving a talk on Mother's Day about the gospel topics essay that my bishop pre-approved before I delivered it? So she had this really supportive bishop, and then she gave this talk that was all about the doctrine, and then had the stake presidency reach out to her and reprimand her. And they said to her that she was creating a chasm in her ward by speaking of her. She said, that's not my goal, so I went silent. But now I sit there in my discomfort over the whole situation and feeling like, how do I speak truth confidently when there's an underlying fear that I'll get reprimanded again? It makes me hesitant to even say Heavenly Mother's name in church after being asked not to. I'm not trying to make others feel uncomfortable by referencing her, but it sure makes me feel uncomfortable not to speak of her. I got really common responses like that. How do people deal with that fear that keeps them feeling alone and misunderstood and keeps them from being able to share truth? And you know, just even like this basic truth on a basic level that even our church says that they believe.
Isn't it interesting that we actually have integrated theology of a feminine divine, which is in some ways quite progressive for a Christian church, you know, in the West at least, right? Notwithstanding there's gobs of Heavenly Mother, you know, theology throughout the world and throughout time, but we have it, but then we are so afraid of it, and there's even almost like a recent entrenchment around an emphasis on not talking about her. And so to me, this is sort of how I see this, Jessica. I think it depends on the temperament of the individual, female or male, because I am privileged to know a lot of very passionate male feminists in my circles, and I love them because they currently have more power than women because we are a patriarchy, so the more the better, right? And so based on their temperament, if somebody wants and feels to enter into their space of formal worship and has that sense of like solidness within and wants to raise their hand and with compassion and prudence, right, talk about these taboo topics, more power to them. I love that. And also, I think it ought to be expected and even anticipated that it's going to frighten people in the room. It is a progressive idea for Latter-day Saints, and it's probably more often than not going to be received both with gratitude from a possible silent majority, but maybe a silent minority, I don't know. But to expect that it's going to bring discomfort into the room. Now, does discomfort mean it's wrong? We've already discussed this. No, it doesn't mean it's wrong. I think it just kind of depends on the nervous system of the individual, right? Like if somebody feels grounded enough and they're deep enough into their journey that they're okay to really, truly live outside of the validation of their neighbors and their father-in-law and whomever, and they recognize there will be blowback, and they have surrendered that I will lose my social equity in this, or I will lose my social capital in my congregation, possibly, if I do this, but it matters enough to me because I want to be an inspired destabilizer, then I think that's lovely. But also to have very realistic expectations, okay?
Yeah.
On the other hand, back to temperament, I think there are many of us that, especially early in our journeys, the impact on our nervous systems is so much to sit in this place that we are accustomed to being comfortable and safe, and to feel a palpable not belonging because all of the sudden our ideas have expanded. I am not a fan, nor will I ever encourage somebody to step into a space where they know that what's going to happen is going to overwhelm them and take them out of their physiological window of tolerance. And so for some people, what they choose to do is to recognize that that is a hill I am not wanting to climb today or this week or this month. And while it's valuable, and that's the only way reform happens is by people actually pushing the envelope a little further and a little further, right? Is that it is a slow process. Whatever ends up evolving, at a collective level will probably not be experienced by the people that do most of the heavy lifting, right? But if you're one of the people that are like, I don't have that in me, or it's too fragile, or it hurts too much, this is where we find other community. This is where I think why my Latter-day Struggles groups have been so healing. It's because we find a community of people where we have something in common, which is our heritage, and we have a bond with it. And there's sort of this pain associated with a part of us that we don't want to just estrange. And we find people where we can say, I feel the depth and the beauty of this, but I also feel the deep pain from it. And then we come together and allow ourselves to process and to talk in safe spaces about what we're experiencing. And I think part of the reason why that's so valuable, Jessica, is because for most of us, whether or not we show up to Sunday school, Relief Society, priesthood, or sacrament meeting, we're going to go home and spend our lives with partners or with adult children or elderly parents. And we can't be truly who we are becoming with them because they're in a different space. And so it's almost like we need a soft space to land and feel seen and known and witnessed and validated and have these beautiful expanding moments, like rejoicing in this light and knowledge that we did not know, and even also processing the grief and the betrayal and the feelings of like, how did I not know and what's going on there? So to process this safely so that we then can go back into these other spaces, certainly our loved ones and maybe the church, and feel like we have been bolstered up and we're strong enough to encounter places or relationships where we love them, but they can't see us. I don't know if that makes sense. So it's like kind of like if you want to go in there and do the hard work, then recognize what the limitations are. Or if you don't, then don't just go without community and find that safe community to give us the strength to then go into these relationships with people that are in other stages of faith.
Absolutely. I think that's so important. And I'm so grateful you brought that up, that importance of community when so many individuals also responded with that feeling of feeling misunderstood and alone. So creating or finding those communities where you don't have to feel that way and where you can be bolstered and help your nervous system calm down in community, right? And process those emotions of grief with others who understand. I know we're running out of time. I want to ask you, are there any other practices that you feel like would just be really important, really helpful for individuals who are dealing with this anger or this sadness? You've talked about how important differentiation is and kind of taking our power back and knowing who we are. You've talked about giving grace to and kind of recognizing where other people are and just making space for that. You've talked about community. Is there anything else that you would really want to leave with our listeners that might help them so they can navigate the more difficult emotions and just really dive more into the joy of this journey?
I think what came to my mind first of all is to enter into a meditation practice. I think that's again fundamental to my work because the meditation is, for me, and I feel confident in saying, it's fundamental to it's fundamental to our finding and embracing who we are as a self. And so it's a really big part of taking back our sovereignty over who we are and our ability to choose who we are and what we believe. And it's also, I think, as we come to know who we are as a true self, we recognize that that which is an embodiment of love comes from God. And that which is an embodiment of fear does not come from God. And I kind of just think that that's super important because when we're on this early faith journey and we are feeling betrayed and legitimately wounded and angry and things like that, there is a time to metabolize and process that. And also, I think if we have good direction and if we have sort of a framework, we are able to work through that, heal from that. That needs to be seen first. It can't just be shoved down and put away. But if we find safe spaces and witnesses to sort of walk us through and help us better understand things like you described, like stages of faith, birth, death, rebirth cycles, understand our childhood, maybe some trauma work might be necessary for some people to sort of understand, like, what did I internalize that has really shifted the trajectory of my life? All of those things, I think, help people realize that order can be found through the chaos. And like you mentioned before, and I will emphasize too, I do this in my work. I'm certainly not the only one. And so I don't want to say just it has to be through my podcast and my Latter-day Struggles communities, but I am one of them. And people do find healing in the chaos, and they actually recognize that this faith journey and this feminist awakening and the finding of our feminine divine, it does lead to peace. It does lead to love, and it does lead to a surrender of the anger, not because we make it stop, but because by itself, it is able to dissipate and be swallowed up in the love and the deeper truth that we find as we go further into the journey. And so that is my goal. And that's what I care about in the work that I do as I serve our community.
I'm so grateful for that work that you do. And I can be a testament as well that, I feel like I've been through all of those hard emotions as well. And yet I feel so much more confident, happy, full, whole now than I did before I went through that journey. And are there moments where I still feel wounded every now and then again? Yes, but they are so much more infrequent and fewer and far between. And it's coming from this basis and this foundation of more wholeness and groundedness and knowing who I am and where I come from. And so thank you so much for all that you shared. Thank you for all the work that you are doing. If anyone is, struggling, feel free to go reach out, go look at Valerie's work, go to the podcast. She has her groups. I'm sure that we can find referrals for if you're looking for additional professional help to navigate maybe some of the trauma that really needs some of that as well. But also, I love the tools that you've given us here today of make sure that you're finding that community, make sure that you are working on knowing who you are and giving grace to others and making space for where we're all at. So thank you, Valerie, so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk to you anytime, Jessica.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this podcast, we invite you to come on over to patreon.com/inherimagepodcast for more content and community. You will have opportunities to participate in Q&A sessions, quarterly book clubs, access to a Marco Polo or Facebook group chat with our hosts, and the insider scoop on events, meetups, and retreats. We're so excited to meet you. And of course, tune in next Sunday for another inspiring episode.